So, welcome, Laura. Welcome to the session.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So, greetings, the formal bit. My name's Angus Winchester. I'm the Global Education Director for the numerous BCB shows around the world. I'll be moderating today's presentation. I'd like to welcome you all to the third pillar of BCB's ongoing engagement with and commitment to our industry during these troubled times. Every Monday at 4 p.m, we'll be bringing you some of the high-quality bar and hospitality education that the shows are renowned for, split between some of the highest rated sessions from last year's events, and also some extra sessions selected from this year's submissions. But firstly, some housekeeping. We will be recording today's webinar and a link will be sent to you tomorrow, and feel free to share it. If you're having any difficulty hearing us today and are listening through your computer, check the speaker volumes turned up or use the chat box located on the right side of your screen. Also, feel free to ask questions through that same chat box. We'll review throughout the presentation, but we're going to try and hold the set questions until the end. So, when creating the education for BCB, we had three main considerations. Is it relevant? Is it educational? And is it interesting? And we felt that this talk ticked all three boxes immensely when we chose it for last year's event. The session, It's Complicated, Rethinking Our Relationship with Alcohol. So, I've spent 2/3 of my life in this industry and I love it. But I also know that there are so many aspects of it that are seemingly toxic. From working conditions to public perception, I believe there's so much that could and should change. But one of its greatest risks, paradoxically, is one of its key components, alcohol. When consumed properly, it's a wonderful substance. But for others, it's the cause of so many issues and problems, from health to wealth, and from poor judgment to truly horrendous behavior. Our presenter today is a leading voice in discussing such matters. Laura Green, Master of Education, is a licensed mental health counselor and spirits educator for Winebow from Chicago. While graduate school was initially a way out of bars, it became painfully clear that the industry was culturally and socially struggling, not only in its rocky relationship with mental health and substance use, but also sexism, racism, classism, and ageism from both sides of the bar. Having realized she holds a unique perspective into these issues, she continues to integrate her clinical and academic experiences into her work in beverage by directing her research and professional focus towards spirits education, but also mental health and wellness of food and beverage professionals, and the holistic health of the beverage industry. Her passion and work are rooted in understanding and improving the mental health and well-being of individuals, particularly through examining the role of culture in the industry as a whole and thoroughly, from seed to service. Whether speaking to booze or brains, Laura believes transparent and responsible education is integral when creating community and organizational change. So, take it away, Laura.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Like Angus introduced me, my name is Laura Green. I am a licensed professional counselor and I worked in hospitality for a long time. And then I decided that I wanted to become a counselor. And by the time I finished, I realized that I really wanted to focus my efforts and my learning and energy on helping in the hospitality industry, since I had experienced so many, constant struggles with this awesome career that's also so challenging. So I put together this seminar, this teaching, just to sort of help people talk through what our relationship with alcohol is and why it is so complicated. And I just want to say too, before I get started, Angus, we went back and forth a little bit about, should we still be presenting, where, especially within the current climate of what's going on, not just the pandemic, but a massive social upheaval and revolution happening. Was this something that was relevant? And ultimately, I just want to share with folks who are watching this at home, I think it is tremendously relevant, because when we are in such high stress situations, our coping mechanisms are where we turn to. And I want to make sure that for my community, as we are engaging socially, as we are exploring parts of ourselves that might be really challenging to explore, that we are coping with those changes in a way that's healthy and careful of ourselves, and where we're honoring ourselves. I'll also say that you might, if you want to go to the next slide, you might feel some things coming up as we talk about these things, and that is totally okay. Our feelings are our friends. This is totally normal to feel things like guilt or grief or sadness or regret. If you do feel those things, just acknowledge that they're natural. Maybe like grab a Post-it or jot something down on your hand to think about later. Or if you want to sort of dip out of this, that's totally okay if it's a little bit too much to manage. Here are some resources for you if you want to utilize them. Also, if you go to healthypour, healthypour.org, you'll be able to find resources there that you can utilize as well under if you need help. So I just want to throw that out to everybody. If you do feel things, totally normal. Don't ignore it though. You know, maybe acknowledge it later, but we'll talk more about that as we go through. So let's go ahead and do the next slide and just go ahead and dive in. Okay, so why do we drink? And Tommy, if you could just go ahead and hit down until everything shows. So we drink because it's delicious. You know, alcohol is delicious, all the different kinds of it, you know, cocktails, wine. It creates an elevated dining experience. Even though it's poison, you know, essentially what we're drinking and consuming is poison. It's just a really enjoyable experience. In that vein, it's also experiential education. So something that I love so much about wine and spirits in particular is that you are able to travel through time and space in your glass. You can, you know, if I'm drinking a 25-year-old Isla, I'm like, oh, this is what Isla tasted like 25 years ago. And that's extraordinary from Chicago, you know, from across the world. Like, that's an extraordinary thing. So experiencing that and experiencing how spirits integrate with each other in a cocktail or in a dining experience, that's a really wonderful thing. Alcohol also acts as a social lubricant. What it does is it essentially inhibits your behavior. So all your you're like in your frontal lobe, you're no longer inhibited. So you're going to be a little bit more outgoing. You're also going to be, since alcohol is a depressant, you're going to kind of come down a little bit. And these are all nice things when we are to experience when we're engaging with other people, especially if we're feeling some kind of anxiety about our social situation. You know, alcohol can be a really wonderful way to connect with people, which brings me to the next piece, which is community and intimacy. Even just the act of consuming something with a group of people is very, very intimate. And then you pair that with that social lubrication and that kind of like that light loss of inhibition when you're consuming in a way that it is a light loss of inhibition and not a total loss of inhibition. That's a really wonderful social experience. Ritual. We drink because it's ritual, either through religious practices or even just a cheers, salud. You know, these are all ritualistic pieces that connect us. And you can also see as I'm going through all of these pieces, they're interwoven into each other. Even though I've isolated them in bullet points, social lubricant comes into community, you know, ritual comes into experiential education and so on. And then the last one, and probably the most challenging piece, is coping. Since alcohol is a depressant, since it is, you know, inhibiting your behavior, it can also act as a coping mechanism. So I'm going to go a little bit more into what coping mechanisms are, and we can sort of pick apart why hospitality is often utilizing coping mechanisms like substances, particularly alcohol. All right, go ahead to the next slide. Can you go to the next slide? Did you hear me? Is it working?
Let's hope so. Go on, Tommy.
Tommy, you there?
Let's hope he's hasn't stepped away from his desk. He should know he's presenting this.
Oh no. I just hope it's not.
Maybe his computer's frozen. Have you got your presentation in front of you?
Yeah, I do. Let me see. Let me pull it up. Maybe. Nope, that's not the button.
Well, we should I presume his computer's
maybe
frozen. Yeah, I think his computer's frozen.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, let me see. Okay, alcohol's many hats. Cool. So alcohol within the realm of what we do, specifically as bartenders, and a lot of these, you know, are very specific to bartenders, but also expand beyond. Like, I work in distribution right now, so this is, it falls into my world as well. but also into back of house, hosts. It's all woven into the culture. Alcohol has many hats. It's a creative outlet. You know, when I was in graduate school, I wrote a paper about this in my substance use class. And I wrote that, you know, even though it's poison, I use alcohol like a painter uses paint, you know, and it's something to think about as we interact with this substance, with this liquid, that it is a creative outlet, and it's a quite beautiful one that really should be respected, you know. So it's a creative outlet. It's a creative medium and an artistic medium for us. It's also our source of income. You know, I from a personal standpoint, I often, you know, experience a little bit of dissonance because on one hand, I'm saying, you know, alcohol is poison. On the other hand, I'm facilitating the sale of it and the consumption of it, you know, and that's where it gets a little bit murky and why it's important to be very mindful of how you understand alcohol and things like that, because as a bartender who's maybe watching this from home, you might be experiencing those same things, the same feelings that I do. It's a subject to study. Like, I've got tons of books about booze. I love reading about booze. I love finding, you know, a bottle and tasting through it and, you know, writing down my tasting notes and this is how old I think it is, blinds, all of that. It's a wonderful subject to study. And it's an anthropological subject as well, and a cultural subject, you know, and agriculture. So it's not just what are my tasting notes, but it's a broad exploration of, you know, something that's, again, allows us to travel through time and space. It's collectible. I have my closet collection of booze that I don't open. It's a social conduit, coming back to that sort of social interaction. It's also a form of currency. And this is something I especially want bartenders at home to think about, is you don't give away free shots to people that you don't like. So we often use providing alcohol as a form of currency to express our love for each other and our care for each other. And that can be very confusing because on one hand, you might not want to be over serving your friends, but on the other hand, that outreach feels so good to get, to be like, wow, they love me enough. They just threw me a free cocktail. That's so nice to walk into a bar and just have a Miller High Life and a shot of Fernet sitting there. You know, that's like, oh man, they're looking out for me. But at the same time, there is a balance there. And then of course, a coping mechanism. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Okay, talking about stress. Stress arises when individuals perceive that they cannot adequately cope with the demands being made on them, or the demands being made, or the threats to their well-being. Sorry, I have a typo in there. And I bring that up because stress is all about perception. What is stressful to one person might not be stressful to another person. And stress, even though stress might be something might be causing you to feel stress at one point in your life, that might not be true for your entire life. So it's all about perception. And it's also about the moment. Something that might not normally cause you stress is now totally causing you stress because of other things that are going on. Let's say there is a global pandemic happening. And then on top of it, you have a massive social upheaval happening. And there's a lot of fear in that. So that's two compounded stressors, right? And then on top of it, maybe you experience something else. That's three compounded stressors. And those might have been individually, you might have been individually able to address one at a time, but all three of them, all four of them, all five of them, like whatever your life looks like, it's all about perception. So it's also important as we talk about these things to know that stress is not a one-size-fits-all situation. And it's a very personal thing, which is where, you know, you doing your work to understand that is going to be really, really important, because then your coping mechanisms are also not a one-size-fits-all thing. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Okay, the benefits of stress. Okay, so Tommy, I would just say go ahead and open up all of these. So stress, I mean, there's a reason why we experience stress. You know, our bodies and minds are functioning all the time, essentially to save us. You know, everything that's happening in your body, either cognitively or physiologically, is happening to preserve your life, right? So stress promotes growth, meaning when you are in a stressful situation, that's a key indicator that something needs to be addressed and needs to change, right? That you need to grow in some way, or you need to address whatever that is causing you stress. It helps you build resilience. Managing stressful situations helps prepare you for future stressors. So if you have, like, let's say you've gone through something, a job that has been especially stressful, and you managed it and you got it together and you got it under control, you can maybe go into another position that's a little bit higher and be able to manage that. And then you just step into these new positions that are helping you to grow. When appropriately addressed, stressors become less stressful. You know, something that might have been stressful at one point, if you've managed it adequately with like helpful coping mechanisms, they aren't as stressful anymore. This only happens when the individual can cope with the stress in a healthy and effective way. So we'll talk a little bit about that in the next coming slides, about when you just kind of numb something and when you don't. Stress becomes a problem when it isn't adequately addressed, and this level of stress is known as chronic stress. So when you're constantly at a high level of stress, as opposed to more episodic up and down pieces. All right, go ahead to the next slide. Okay, here we go, coping. So coping is an ongoing process that helps the mind and body mitigate the effects of stressors. So that means that we are never not coping, right? And I want you to keep that in mind, that we are always coping. And I use this photo, if anyone has ever watched Chernobyl on HBO, he's talking about the reactor and all the things, all of these safety measures that are put in place for the reactor in case this thing happens and this thing comes and swoops in. And if that fails, this happens, and then this comes in, and this happens and this comes in. Our bodies and minds are acting the same way. So if you remove a coping mechanism, let's say, or you don't have access to one, another one's going to come in and find its way in to help you there. So go ahead to the next piece. Coping mechanisms can be intentional or automatic. You know, sometimes we don't realize, it's more subconscious, that we don't realize that we're utilizing something as a coping mechanism, or the emotional response that's a coping mechanism, or sometimes they're quite intentional. If I have a bad day, I might be like, you know what, I'm going to go ride my bike for a minute. When I had access to a pool, I'd be like, I'm just going to go shut down and like get in my pool and get my head straight for a minute and go from there, knowing that that's a coping mechanism. This is important because that means you have freedom to start to change your coping mechanisms if you need to. Okay, go to the next piece. And determining whether coping mechanisms are healthy or not is entirely dependent on the individual. And I have a slide later on that will go deeper into that, but some coping mechanisms that work for some people might not work for other people. I remember when I was in graduate school, a lot of my cohort would be like, oh yeah, trashy TV and wine help me to cope after work. But I work in booze, and so booze couldn't be my coping mechanism, you know? So it's a very personal thing and very, very about what you need. Okay, so go ahead to the next slide. I'm kind of flying through this. I hope it's all making sense.
Yeah, perfect.
Cool. Okay, cool. So examining coping mechanisms and skills. And Tommy, just go ahead and run through all these too. So you may not be able to control all that you can experience, but you can control how you react to it. So this is especially relevant right now. When I wrote this slide, it was more in relation to our relationship with the guest, that you might have a guest come in that's a total dick, you know, and you can't really control their behavior, but what you can control is what you put out to it. Or managing stress, that becomes, you know, your work to do so that you can, you know, not only de-escalate the situation, but blah, blah, blah. But in a situation like this, where we have a lot of large social factors coming in that are affecting us, a lot of that we can't control, but we can control how we are coping and how we're reacting to it. So your brain and body are constantly seeking ways to cope with stress. And from that, you have three choices. You can immediately confront the stressor in order to grow. You can numb your emotional response and not grow and just like, nope. Or you just totally repress it and you don't grow at all. And what we see a lot is the numbing of an emotional response for a time and then confronting it later. And we do this often on the job as bartenders. But when it gets to the point that we're just numbing it and just like repressing it down and never actually confronting it, that's when we run into issues. Okay, so next slide. Okay, adaptive versus maladaptive coping. So go just go ahead and fill this one out. Adaptive coping mechanisms are those that help us to confront stressors and manage their effects in ways that do not harm our bodies and minds. So adaptive, it's really in the word, right? So we are utilizing coping mechanisms that are allowing us to problem solve, that are allowing us to grow as individuals in order to really address the stress that's happening to us. And to be adaptive, this means it also cannot do harm to our bodies or minds. And that's important to remember. Maladaptive coping mechanisms often relieve the effects of the stressor temporarily, but do not address the root problems or source of the stress. So that means like just kind of shutting down and turning off and like blasting loud music in your ears, but never actually coming back to what was causing your stress to address it. This is also true, as I say this out loud, this is also true in relationships, that if you hit pause on an interpersonal problem and never actually address it, the relationship never gets better. And so our relationship with that stressor that we're interacting with that's causing us stress, if it's never fixed, it's never going to get better. And I hope that makes sense for those of you tuning in. All right, go ahead to the next page. Active versus avoidant coping mechanism. Now, this is very similar to adaptive versus maladaptive coping. Active coping refers to coping mechanisms that actively address why and how the stress is causing stress. Avoidant coping mechanisms refer to coping mechanisms that ignore the issue or event, even if the individual is aware there's a problem. So a little bit about this, because I think this is really relevant to what is happening right now outside of the global pandemic in terms of, especially in the United States, a social uprising, a revolution where people are becoming more aware of their role in the world and how they're interacting with other people and harming other people, or so many things that people are engaging with themselves right now. So avoidant coping is when you know there's a problem, when you know that, let's say, you're contributing to something, but you don't fix it. So you can be coping in terms of like an avoidant coping mechanism and know that there's an issue that needs to be fixed and not fix it. That's a pretty solid recipe for emotional disaster, and probably at the end of the day, interpersonal disaster. And for those of you who are managers or leaders in your communities at home, it's especially important for you to not be engaging in avoidant coping, that you are taking steps to actively address the issues in your lives, because it's going to, what we find is that it explodes out in other ways, and usually out on other people, which is why I wanted to add this in as we're engaging with something that's pretty socially heavy, that we are taking care of ourselves so that we can protect other people, from our emotional, potential emotional outbursts. All right, go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so active and adaptive coping mechanisms. These are really great coping mechanisms to rely on and explore. Problem solving is that's my go-to coping mechanism, and my when you're working behind a bar, it's a great coping mechanism to utilize, of like, okay, so we have this cocktail menu and we keep running out of coops. How about we switch this to this and this, and then you're eliminating pieces. You're eliminating and problem solving that, so that either the stress goes away. Also, it feels good to actively move towards something, right? Meditation is another one. And I don't mean to go all like hippy dippy on y'all, but like there's science and like decades of science that says meditation is a really wonderful way to cope with situations. What's really great about meditation as well is that it's like this sort of emotional mise en place for yourself too, that as you encounter stressful situations, if you're in a place where your brain is a little bit more steady, you are able to address it in a way that's more malleable and able to go in with a clear head and peace. There's something about stress that I should add, that when stress is compounded, if you don't have stress, you might have this much space to be able to work within, and think clearly and all these structural pieces. As stress compounds, that space gets smaller and smaller. So then you don't have really a lot of, if you think about it like the Atari game, you don't have a lot of room then, and that causes more stress too, and it's harder to adapt. Something like meditation sort of opens that up for you. Processing with friends, family, or a mental health professional is a great coping mechanism. Talking through situations with people, saying, I feel like this, allowing yourself to be vulnerable and heard. These are all really great ways to cope. Physical movement, like our minds and bodies are totally connected, and stress causes energy in our bodies. When we are experiencing stress, we have these cognitive and physiological symptoms that come up, and that includes like heightened adrenaline, hypervigilance, heightened cortisol. Like, so you're essentially, shallow breathing, because when you're feeling stress, your body's like ready to go. So to sort of dissipate that, breath and getting it out of your body through physical movement can be really, really effective, so that you can kind of come down from it and then start exploring it. And then reflection through things like journaling, art, making music, just, writing a song, or, writing a poem. So many different ways to reflect on what happened, and what's causing you stress. All right, go ahead to the next slide. So avoidant and maladaptive coping mechanisms. And I added these because I want to just acknowledge before I go into these that it's not necessarily that avoidant and maladaptive coping mechanisms are bad. They're only bad when that's all you use and you never move into that avoidant place. You might be in a place where you can't confront things yet, and you need that avoidant or maladaptive piece to keep yourself alive, and, emotionally sound until you can go. An example of that, coming back to the bar, is you have 20 tickets coming out of the machine at a single time. You can't be like, I need to problem solve right now. I can't meditate right now. What you need to do is just put your head down and get it done, and then confront it later. So these aren't bad. They're just different. Denial, like if you're not ready to receive something, just denial. Employing defense mechanisms. So, I think we all know what defense mechanisms are, but when someone comes to you with an issue and you get automatically defensive and you start throwing it back at them. Substance misuse. So using substance in a way that's going to be numbing, so that you don't have to think about something. Compartmentalization. So saying like, I'm just going to put that into a box, and maybe I'll open it later. Right. Another way that happens is through, which is extreme, is through something called dissociation. When people separate, like in extreme traumatic levels of stress, where people sort of separate themselves from their experience. I had a bartender once tell me that he was so busy and so stressed from opening his bar that he forgot his name, and I was like, bro, that's a lot of stress. So self-harming behaviors and risk-taking kind of go hand in hand. Self-harming behaviors can be, in an instance of alcohol drinking until you black out drunk. It can be cutting. It could be, excessive substance use. It could be not taking care of yourself and, allowing yourself to feel pain because and these are all interwoven into each other. Risk-taking, something like drinking and driving. I'm invincible, but you're not, sort of thing. And displacement is when it's tied in with something called misattribution, where you take it and you're like, well, I'm going to put it all on you now. Like I'm experiencing stress, so I'm going to take it out on my spouse or my partner or the dog, something like that. Your staff. So that's displacement, and that gets it out for a minute, but it doesn't ever actually address the issue, and it's also often harmful to other people. All right, go ahead and move to the next slide. So these are the ones that get a little dicey, right? So the in-betweens, canceling plans. Like you might be in a high stress situation and you're like, you know what? I'm going to cancel my plans because I need to deal with this. That's one thing. But then when you're constantly canceling plans because you're avoiding feeling something with your friends, that's another thing. And something like canceling plans, especially when you have people who are introverted within a very extroverted career that demands like a show, canceling plans can sometimes be very maladaptive, whereas other times it is a form of really wonderful, an expression of caring for yourself in a great way. Sometimes you want to keep your plans because you can utilize the care of your friends and family, you know? Compulsive exercise. Exercise is such a wonderful, wonderful coping mechanism. But when it gets to be a little bit more compulsive in terms of you're shutting down and you feel like you must exercise and you feel guilty if you don't exercise, or you exercise past the point of injury, that you're injured and you still do it and you're becoming so reliant on it, but it's more pushing the issues that you're trying to, that you probably should address into a corner through exercise, that's when it starts to be a problem. And I want to remind folks as I go through this that when I say like an adaptive one does not cause harm to your body or mind, if you are causing harm to your body through compulsive exercise, that's not going to be a super dope thing. Same thing with food. We need food, just like exercise, we need food to live. But if your consumption of food is harmful to you, or it's harmful to your mind in the sense that it's causing deep levels of shame or guilt, and it's becoming detached from, you know, what is so wonderful of it, and it's becoming something that's not about your health and well-being and, you know, livelihood and joy and sharing, and it becomes a source of, you know, pain and guilt and shame. That's when we're running into issues with food. And not just eating it, but like abstaining from eating it as well. Sometimes when we don't feel super in control of a situation, we control our food, or we control our exercise, we control our bodies, and it's going to be up to the individual to explore where their boundaries are in that realm, to know when it passes the point of being healthy and helpful. Venting and valving. You know, valving is like when you go into the walk-in cooler and scream for a second just to get it out, you know, and these processes are useful if you find yourself in a situation that maybe you have a guest or someone coming at you and you can't say what you want to say back to them, and it just bubbles and bubbles and bubbles. You know, venting and valving is really, really, really useful. There's other ways to do that. That doesn't involve screaming, including like, you know, tensing and relaxing your fists, breath control. The reason it's in an in-between is because if you only rely on that and you don't address it, that's, again, where it comes into a problem. Same thing with venting with your colleagues, which kind of is going to bring me into this next big piece, that if you are out at the bar after work, right, and you are utilizing this social connection and processing piece with your colleagues, but you're just complaining about it and not addressing it, and then combining it with substance use, you're crossing over all of these different in-betweens that get, I mean, to the name of this presentation, get very complicated, and they're hard to unravel. Work is another one of those things. If you use something like problem solving as your primary coping mechanism, and you go to work and you're problem solving that, but then you start to use work to escape other things in your life, you know, you start picking up more hours, you can't stay away. That's when work becomes a challenging and probably unhealthy coping mechanism as well. You know, and with all of these, I very, very, very much encourage you, you know, folks tuning in at home, to just examine how these pieces play in their lives, how they play in your life. You know, when they feel good and when maybe they don't. So yeah, and of course, substance use with friends, drinking at the bar. On one hand, it can be a really great stress relief and a really great time to connect with people. On the other hand, if you're blacking out every night and you don't know how you got home, that's when I start to get concerned. All right, so let's do the next slide. All right, cool. So these are little vignette scenarios. So Tommy, go ahead and hit the first one. Cool. So helping a colleague with a cocktail menu development. So I have all of the things that we've already been through. First of all, it's delicious, it's experiential education, and it builds community and intimacy. It's also a creative outlet, artistic medium, a source of income, and a subject to study. So you can start to see how helping a colleague with a cocktail menu development can be a really healthy way to explore all of these pieces. All right, go ahead to the next one. Attending an in-depth rare whiskey tasting. It's delicious, it's experiential education, it's a subject to study, and it's collectible. Okay, in the next one. Attending a dinner with coursed rare whiskey pairings. It's delicious, it can enhance the dining experience, experiential education, it's a social lubricant, community and intimacy, and it's ritual. So you can see how we're ticking all of these different boxes. It's also a subject to study, collectible, a social conduit. All right, in the next one. Okay, taking shots of Malort after said dinner with guests until the bar closes down. That can be social lubricant, community and intimacy, ritual. Like I just had a memory of taking shots of Malort with a winemaker that I was like, I'm never going to forget this. And that was a really wonderful memory, and I'm happy to do it. Anyway, social conduit and currency. But it's also, I'm going to hit the next one. Can you hit the next one, Tommy? It can also be a coping mechanism. You know, maybe dinner was a little stressful, you know, and again, it's going to be up to the individual to really understand that for themselves. All right, go ahead to the next slide. Oh, and it's delicious.
You're such a Chicago girl.
Yeah, this is so Chicago.
Yeah.
I forgot I did that. All right, go ahead to the next one. All right, tasting and spitting product while working. It's experiential education, it's a source of income, and it's a subject to study. And now notice it's the spitting, right? All right, the next. Taking shots behind the bar or team building. It's delicious, it's community and intimacy, ritual, and coping. It's also a social conduit and a coping mechanism. So I hope as we go through these, you're seeing how these many hats that alcohol wears for us are very intertwined, and it can get muddy and confusing. All right, go to the next one. Taking shots with an industry regular after a busy rush. It's delicious, social lubricant, community and intimacy, ritual, coping, social conduit, currency, coping. All right, next one. Drinking for free at the friend's bar after a rough shift. Similar, right? And the last one. Oh, that was it. So I hope that makes sense. Oh, you can go ahead to the next one. That's cool. I hope that makes sense for you all, and I hope that you're also processing at home how your relationship with alcohol is, and some of those vignettes might seem familiar, maybe some of them don't, specifically the Malort, whatever, I'll forgive it. But it begs the question then, is your relationship with alcohol healthy? All right, go ahead to the next slide. And how to recognize when it isn't. All right, go ahead and just show all these, that's cool. So when drinking becomes mindless, when you're not intentionally consuming anymore, that you're just, you know, just downing it. And you start prioritizing drinking over other activities. Yeah, or relationships, prioritizing drinking over relationships, or prioritizing drinking with going home. So those are some things to pay attention to. Increased irritability, increased symptoms of depression. There's actually, I was going to grab my DSM-5, but it's propping at my computer, but there's actually a diagnosable depressive disorder that is brought on by alcohol. Often people are experiencing depression because of their overconsumption of alcohol, and that's because it is a depressant. So if we examine within that our very high levels of depression within our industry, I can't help but wonder if there is a sort of in and out happening of causing our depression while treating our depression at the same time. You know, some people certainly experience depression without alcohol and might be coping with it through that, but it's no matter what, it's not going to help, you know. Drinking and secrecy, kind of hard to say right now since we're all at home alone, but like if you find yourself needing to, when you have social opportunities, drink by yourself or hide that you're drinking so much, that's an indication that there's a problem. Guilt associated with drinking, you know, that moment when you wake up the next morning and just feel so guilty, or you don't want to admit to your doctor that you drink so much, or you're hiding those pieces. Those are indications that there's a problem. You might not even drink that much, but if you are feeling guilty about it, that's something to pay attention to. You're experiencing relationship issues as a result of your drinking. Maybe you're getting in fights with your partner, or you know, your bar has a culture where there's a lot of drinking behind the bar and bartenders are getting in fights or with the line or whatever. That's an indication too. And then of course, blacking and browning out. If you're experiencing blackouts or brownouts, it's a very strong indication to maybe examine some of your behaviors and your relationship with alcohol. All right, go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so why is our industry so at risk? Okay, go ahead and click down. So excessive drinking is normalized. You know, when I started working as a clinician in graduate school during my internship, I had this moment that I was like, I can't show up here wasted at 9:30 in the morning. Why, or hungover or whatever, or late, you know, why do I have this in my head that I can do this when I'm behind the bar? And I just started thinking why it's acceptable for us to do that, but not in other professions. And, you know, being wasted is normalized. We don't really hold ourselves or our peers accountable very often. You know, I can't tell you how many times in my life I've acted an absolute fool. And the next day I show up all guilty and feeling, you know, hateful towards myself. And my colleagues are like, oh no, it's fine. We all go through that. Don't worry about it. You know, like, thank you, you know, but no, you know. All right, go ahead to the next one. Drinking hangovers at work are tolerated, excused, and even celebrated. Dude, you were so wasted last night. That was hilarious. You know, all right, go ahead to the next one. Alcohol is used as a social currency. You know, it is how we express love. It's how we express care for each other. You know, making a. I'm not sure I understand. Oh my God, my Siri just started talking to me. It's, you know, it's how. It's a really wonderful thing to make a beautiful cocktail for a friend and hand it to them and watch them enjoy it and say, I made that for you. I created that for you. And that's really wonderful. But it also puts us in a very high risk situation when all of these other things are so muddy for us. Okay, go ahead to the next one. I think there's one more. Yes. And we have a superhero complex. Oh my God. Like, why do we cut strangers off, but we don't cut our friends off? There's something about us in this industry that we don't think that the effects of alcohol are going to impact us. Maybe because we work with it or we appreciate it or we love it or whatever. But I see it more often than not that, you know, we think we're immune to the problems of alcohol. And I think that's the last one, but maybe there's one more. I don't remember. Oh, and then, this is the big, this one always makes me feel things, because without alcohol, what would connect us? You know, it is the wire that connects all of us. It's the main interest. We come from so many different backgrounds in our lives. We all have different hobbies, and some of those overlap, but the one thing that without a doubt connects us is our work, and our work is alcohol. And it's sometimes hard to give that up or give that a back seat, because it is the thing that connects us to people. I've met most of my friends through alcohol, you know, so but it does put us at a higher a higher risk. All right, go ahead to the next slide. What can we do? All right, next one. Okay, go ahead and just open this one up. So understanding alcohol misuse and alcoholism, I think sometimes people think that they don't have a problem with alcohol or other substances because they're like, well, I can quit anytime. I did No Drink November, I did Dry January, I did all these things. I do not have an issue, except alcohol misuse is, you are misusing alcohol when you are drinking, when your drinking is negatively impacting your work and relationships. As a clinician, that is a very, that is a key piece of, like, you might be drinking 3 drinks a week or whatever, but when you do, it negatively impacts your work. It is what we call clinically significant, that it is impeding on your ability to thrive. That is an indication. Like, you might not be physically addicted, but if it's still impeding on your ability to thrive, that's when we're seeing issues. If you're experiencing chronic brown and blackout, that's usually an indication of your rate of consumption. And if you're consuming that fast, you're also probably not taking the time to appreciate what it is that you're drinking, and you're probably drinking for another reason. Your life centers around drinking every single bit. You're always just like, when am I going to have that drink? When am I going to have that drink? And again, you might not be physically dependent, but if you built your life around the consumption of alcohol, we're running into some issues, and probably these other pieces like chronic blackouts, negatively impacting your work and relationships. These things are probably coming into play too. And if, like, inside of you, you feel the need to stop, if you're like, oh, I got to cut back, that's an indication that you're misusing as well. Alcoholism, that physical dependency is all of those pieces, but you're physically addicted. That includes shaking. You're having, like, physical cravings for it. You start sweating when you haven't had any alcohol, and then you're experiencing also severe mood swings. Go ahead to the next slide. Things that we can do. Okay, go ahead and just fill this one out. Cool. So as individuals, give yourself time to observe your behavior. Journaling is just really, really amazing. And you don't have to be like your diary, whatever, but even just like taking the time in a notebook that's yours to jot down some things. Like, sometimes I find just writing a single sentence down is, like, so clarifying and helpful for me. Or just having quiet reflection on your behavior and starting to think about why you do things the way that you do. Be kind to yourself and, like, forgive yourself. If you are over consuming, like, it's not going to do you any good to hate yourself for it, So just accept, like, oh, this is something I kind of found myself in now. I'm going to try to start consuming mindfully, and also being aware that you might take some steps back, as you pursue a more mindful consumption pattern. Enlist the support of family and friends. Now, this does not mean posting it on Facebook. This does not mean doing some massive declaration, but just saying to someone, or being like, I'm sober now. You don't have to do that. You can just be like telling a good friend, or like, if your friend is your bartender that always gets you wasted, just being like, I'm trying to cut back a little bit. If you could help me, that would be really great. Taking professional help through the help of a therapist, your doctor, that can also be a religious leader. Just finding someone who's trained to help people through something like this is really helpful, because it is a daunting thing to undertake if you are trying to cut back. Because again, it is a relationship, and there's a grief process that when you're changing your relationship with alcohol, there's loss there and there's grief there. And it's helpful to have somebody with you through each of those steps to really address that. And this one is really, really, really important. Don't go sober alone. If you do decide to quit drinking, please, I absolutely beg you, please do it under the supervision of a health professional. It is very, very dangerous to quit drinking by yourself. It can lead to seizures. It can lead to hallucinations, heart attacks, delirium tremens. It's it's not a good situation. I think as a culture, we have it in our heads that like detoxing from heroin is the absolute worst one. But like detoxing from heroin isn't going to kill you. It's going to suck. It's just going to suck, but it's not going to kill you. Quitting alcohol can kill you. So please don't do it by yourself. As a community, leaders can model appropriate consumption. If you're a manager, like not taking shots with your staff, you know, and I know that it is also a community piece and it's a ritual piece and everything, but modeling, I'm going to go out after work and I'm going to have 1 or 2 beers and I'm going to dip. Like that is a really great way to share with your community an appropriate model of consumption, right? Compassionately holding colleagues accountable. Show up the next day instead of being like, yo, bro, that was so funny. You were so wasted. Just be like, I was really concerned about you last night. And let's work together to maybe so that we don't do that anymore. Something like that. Advocate for and or develop systems to allow drinks folks to cope healthily. That includes creating psychological safety in the workplace. That includes, providing adequate tools to mitigate stress so that people can do their jobs effectively so they don't have to turn to a coping mechanism, staffing appropriately, paying people appropriately. There's a lot of ways, when we talk about alcohol consumption, there are a lot of other things involved in that. And then authentic drinks education. Like I work in distribution and I was also a buyer for a long time, and I've been on a lot of things, a lot of events that they call education just getting everyone wasted. That's not education. If we can actually effectively educate people on, where these spirits are coming from, who's making them, the process, all of these really wonderful, beautiful pieces, my hope is that then we don't just like down the hatchet, which is, something to be mindful of too when we're drinking spirits, something that spent 8 years in a barrel just for us to not even spend the time to taste it. That's kind of a bummer. Or to be blackout so that we can't even enjoy it. That's a bummer. Okay, go ahead to the next slide.
Folks, I would say if you do have any questions, now is probably the time to ask them so that we can type them in the box so that I can ask Laura in a few moments.
Cool. So sobriety. Again, always seek the help of a medical and mental health professional when you're going sober. Detoxing can be lethal. Don't do it alone. Allow yourself some time to grieve. It's a relationship. Your social circle might change. When people are only connected through alcohol and you stop drinking, that connection might not be there anymore. And that sucks, but it's also necessary. And you might see yourself becoming friends with other people who share other interests, and allowing yourself space and time for that, and the grieving process for those relationships. And your relationship with your drinks career might change as well. And I've already seen that happening with a few folks during this period, when we've been separated from our work in a lot of ways. It's just a question of, and this is a hard question to ask, and this is why I'm an advocate of like therapy and processing and support, is, am I in the industry so that I can drink, or am I drinking because of the culture of the industry? And it might be a combination of those two things, but it is just something to be mindful of. At the end of the day, the choice to go sober is very personal, and it's not a one-size-fits-all deal. I think there was a period where sobriety was being fetishized in our industry, but I think that for some people, it is possible to control their drinking and to reimagine their relationship with alcohol without having to go totally sober. But if sobriety's for you, like, go sober. It's not a one size fits all thing, and it's not a clear cut path that everybody can go down. It's going to be very personal to you and what you need. And go ahead to the next slide. We did it. That's it. And these are the same resources for you. Just for a refresher, if you're like totally overwhelmed by all of that and need to like maybe start thinking about talking to somebody, there's some resources.
Let's leave them up while we have a couple of questions. I mean, you touched on the word once in the presentation, alcoholism. Now, yes. I mean, I dated an addict and learnt about the sense of addiction, alcoholism in particular. But I mean, she was addicted to numerous things, and was an addict and truly believed that it's a disease like cancer or depression. But potentially, unlike depression, you won't cure it. You merely cope with it, etc. I mean, do you feel that some people do have a underlying terrible problem with alcohol, that complete abstinence is the only real solution?
I do, yeah, and it's that comes from our relationship with alcohol or other forms of addiction come from so many different things. It's a combination of nature versus nurture. First of all, like there are family sort of family pieces, genetic, if you will. So that's kind of the wrong word. I'm blanking a little bit. There are learned behaviors. There's also inherited behaviors as well. Some people just find themselves to be more impulsive. That can also come from like traumatic brain injuries. That can come from traumatic experiences as a child. When I was practicing, I had a lot of adult clients who were experiencing issues with substance use and other things, coming in and out of homelessness and different pieces. And the one thing that they all had in common is they experienced a tremendous trauma when they were a child. So for them, I wouldn't say like, this isn't a harm reduction situation. We aren't going to cut back. We're going to work together to take this away so that we can address this. And that's part of the uncomplicating things too. So again, it depends. I think that there are some people who, and I do think it's also a disease, and it's a terrible disease. Yeah. It's really hard to overcome, and it's incredibly painful for people who are experiencing it and who are, care for people who are experiencing it. I hope that answered the question. It was a lot. Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, then the other question is, you mentioned it a couple of times, peer pressure. The drinking of shots in the bar, the hanging out at the bar after work, after work drinks, things like that. That is often, it's the not being able to deal with that peer pressure that actually leads to overconsumption and things like that. I mean, is there a way of dealing with things like that? Is that something that should be addressed?
I mean,
a follow-on from it.
For sure. So it's important to acknowledge that within those going out after work pieces, that sense of community, if someone's in a position that they decide that they can't go out after work because they really can't be drinking, but it's too triggering to be out and with everybody drinking and it's not helpful, the consequence is like a sort of social self-ostracism. And ostracism in and of itself is incredibly painful for someone to experience. So if someone's doing that to themselves and they can't be a part of it, that's painful. And then they're more likely to go back and insert themselves back into it so that they're not feeling those feelings of ostracism and isolation. So something to mitigate that is the asking for help, enlisting the help of maybe one colleague or one friend, and finding that connection somehow in other places, either before work or on an off day, so that people are able to connect. And also like enlisting the support as you're more comfortable of the people in your bar to be like, I want to hang out with you guys. I like you all. I want to feel like I'm a part of this, but I can't really be doing it after work. And if you aren't in a place that you can say that yourself, if you can enlist the help of somebody who you work with to advocate for you, even quietly, just to be like, how about we all do this instead? That's a really nice way to cut that out. But also with the peer pressure piece, it's not just the people who are trying to cut back, but those of us who are maybe like, come out with us. Oh, you never come out with us, whatever. Maybe chill on that and get people's consent before you send them a shot or a beer, or guilt trip them into coming out with you, because you don't know what they're experiencing or what changes they're trying to make in their lives.
And of course, we're talking about an environment where theoretically you do have leaders, and that the stressful times we're living in society at the moment, good, effective leadership, caring, compassionate leadership, setting examples, but also looking after the people underneath you is key. So, Laura, as you probably heard, that was the tolling of the bell.
I heard the clock. Yeah.
It's the end of the hour. So really, I mean, thank you so much for this. I mean, it
Thank
was
you for having me.
as good as I thought. The resources, the video tomorrow will be fantastic. I'd love to talk to you more about it, sort of moving forward, but that's the end of all the time we have today. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for attending today's webinar. It's Complicated, Rethinking Our Relationship with Alcohol. Just as a reminder, we will be sending a recording of the webinar tomorrow. Didn't get a chance to answer your questions. Laura's pretty much active on most social media and things like that. And as you can tell, very passionate about helping as well as sharing this knowledge. So thank you again. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next Monday at 4 o'clock. Thanks, Laura.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.